Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining me. Welcome to this webinar. Hopefully, as you can see on the screen, just to make sure that we're all expecting the same thing, we're going to be having a look this afternoon at PAS 2060 and a little bit of information regarding its successor, which we'll touch on later in the presentation. So we're going to look at how we can use a standard called PAS 2060, publicly available specification 2060, to look at carbon neutrality. So that's hopefully where we all are, and if that's what you're expecting, then you're in the right place. Just a couple of slides that I'll quickly skip through that I always sort of semi-joke, I'm contractually obliged to show you. Tells you just a little bit about us. Who we are if you've never come across NQA before, and some of our clients that you may or may not recognize, depends where you are, I guess, on a global basis. That's me, Richard Walsh. I'm NQA's principal assessor covering environment and energy, and I've now been at NQA for 17 years. So you might argue I'm a little bit of an old hand at this now. And in the last 3 or 4 years, I've also been working alongside environment and energy, working much more in sustainability, looking at carbon, a lead carbon verifier, looking at carbon neutrality, journeys to net zero, and verifying people's carbon footprints. So hopefully that will tick most of the boxes there. If you've sat in on one of my webinars before, you'll know how this works. We have about 45 minutes looking. I think there's about 45 slides to go through, and roughly a minute a slide. It says questions in the chat box. I actually find that confusing. I keep meaning to change that. On the screen, you should see a sort of I don't know what we call it, a box with some options in there. Actually, if you type the questions in the question box, that would be the most logical place to type them. Type them as we're going along. So if something interests you, something hits you, you want to question something, type it in there. If it's relevant and I haven't moved on, then we'll try and answer it at the time. If not, there will certainly be time for questions towards the end. There will be a section at the end. And also, to avoid you all frantically scribbling, trying to write down everything I'm saying, there will be both a recording of the webinar circulated. So all our webinars are recorded. They are all uploaded to our YouTube site. We do have a presence on YouTube. We have a channel, NQA channel, and all our webinars, both in this sector, sustainability and environment, in energy, in health and safety, quality, all the different webinars we do get uploaded to there. And also you will receive a PDF copy of all of the slides that I'm using this afternoon. So you don't need to write anything down. You don't need to worry about remembering what I've said. If you're so inclined, you can go back and listen to it all again. So you can hopefully pay attention to everything that we're going to be going through this afternoon. I always like to assume that nobody knows anything before we start on these webinars, and we'll all start from the same place. And I do realize there are some different definitions being bandied around. There's some confusion around some of the different terms. So we'll just have a quick look at what we actually mean and what the standard actually means by the term carbon neutrality. We'll look at what the approach PAS 2060 takes to doing that. So how 2060 manages a company declaring itself as carbon neutral. We'll look at the basic principles. We'll look at the process that the standard requires. There are 4 key stages. Perhaps the next little bit that I should have put in there, we'll also, as I said earlier, be looking at its successor, ISO 14068/1, 14068/1, that has already been published, is running parallel with the standard at the moment, but actually will, towards the end of next year, take over from this standard. But the approaches are very similar, and if you've done this standard, you will be 95% of the way there to transitioning across to 14068. So that just fleshes out a little bit of the things that we talk about. As I say, some of it I'm sure is old hat, some of it we just clarify to ensure that we all understand. And as I say, that just fleshes out a little bit the previous slide. Apologies, the chair I'm sat in creaks a little bit, so if you do hear a bit of creaking, it's the chair, not my bones. Right, okay, so hopefully you can all see the screen. Carbon neutrality. That's the main thing that we're going to be looking at, and as the title suggests, or the name suggests, a state of balance between the carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere and the carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere, a bit like sitting on a seesaw. Both sides are in complete balance. So the carbon that's been emitted, and we could, to be fair, widen that out to cover greenhouse gases, but carbon dioxide is the one that everybody talks about. There are others, as we'll see, but it's all about a state of balance, and that's that neutrality position. At zero carbon, note that that's not net zero, that's zero carbon, I believe is an impossibility. That is that no carbon emissions are being produced at all. We talk about net zero, and there is another alternative, which is absolute zero. And again, that to me is unachievable. So zero carbon is no carbon emissions produced, and some people talk about being carbon negative. So reduction of the carbon footprint to less than neutral. So in other words, more carbon is being pulled out the atmosphere than is actually being emitted by the organisation. So if you think back to the seesaw analogy, the removal side is sort of down, and the production of carbon is higher. So it's all about pulling out more carbon than is actually being produced. The Carbon Trust, who are the UK body who tend to take the lead on this, have a definition of carbon neutrality. They talk about a minimum requirement of covering scopes 1 and 2 emissions, and if you're not sure about the scopes, well, there's a slide later on that will cover that. Has a minimum requirement of covering scopes 1 and 2 emissions, with scope 3 strongly encouraged. However, net zero must cover scope 1, 2 and 3, but we are talking here about carbon neutrality and not net zero. You're right. Well, SBTi net zero definition is quite different from the Carbon Trust, because the Carbon Trust have defined carbon neutrality and have not really defined net zero. So yes, that's why there is a difference. And we're talking here about carbon neutrality. We'll talk a little bit later about how the Science Based Targets initiative ties in with some of this. And there you go. So Science Based Targets initiative have defined net zero targets for corporate bodies as follows. So to reach a state of net zero, it implies 2 conditions: reducing scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions to zero, or, as we've said, more likely to a residual level that's consistent with reaching net zero emissions at the global or sector level in eligible 1.5 degrees centigrade aligned pathways. So in other words, keeping the emissions at a level where the global warming is limited to 1.5 degrees, and following that trajectory of reducing scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions to a residual level that is considered net zero. In other words, you can't get any better. Let's have a look. Yes, Greg, yes, the government's still allowing the 10% window at net zero. It's not really 10% window. If you follow the net zero science-based targets initiative, different sectors, different industries have different residual levels. So that 10% window may well not change slightly, but different industries will have slightly different. Some might be 20%, some might be 8%, some might be 5%. But yes, the government are still allowing that at the moment. I say that because obviously here in the UK with a change of government. And then once you've got to that net zero point, is neutralising then any residual emissions. So neutralising them at the net zero target. So when we're talking about neutralizing, that normally means then allowing for the offsetting of those, and we'll look at offsetting and what that means a little bit later on. So I did mention at the start that ISO 14068-1 or /1, probably -1, says of carbon neutrality and net zero greenhouse gas emissions. So this is the definition now that if we're working towards this using these standards, this is what they will say. Carbon neutrality and net zero greenhouse emissions are related concepts. So they're not they're not different. They are interlinked. They've been defined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as being equivalent. So carbon neutrality and net zero are being defined as equivalent. I might possibly argue that. Who am I, you may say, to argue with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? And I'm not really arguing, I'm just perhaps suggesting a slight clarification of that. However, both refer to the condition in which anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, so that's man-made, are balanced by anthropogenic greenhouse gas removals over a specified period. Okay, so that's where we're at, and that hopefully clarifies some of the answers. I will try and answer some of these, Greg, as we're going along. If you have 14,001, do you need 14068 as an add-on, or is 14,001 satisfactory? It depends. If you want to have a verified claim that you are carbon neutral, 14,001 won't do that. 14,001, as you realise, is a management system for managing your impact on the environment. And yes, you can argue that releasing carbon into the atmosphere is an impact on the environment, quite so. However, as somebody who does a huge amount of ISO 14001 assessing, you cannot use 14001 to say you are carbon neutral. You can say you're carbon neutral, but 14001 won't sort of add any value to that statement. 14068, or indeed PAS 2060, is a certified, and indeed for 14068 will be a UCAS accredited statement that you have been verified as carbon negative, so carbon neutral, not negative, crikey, carbon neutral. And the process we go through is a little bit like having a financial audit. It's a case of looking through the figures, looking through I guess usually on the spreadsheet, looking through the evidence, looking through bills, mileage claims, deliveries of fuel, energy bills, gas bills, and coming up with a verification that that carbon footprint is what it is, and then verifying the outputs. So yeah, it's an add-on. It would run alongside 14,001, and certainly having 14,001 would be a benefit. So just to come back to the slide that we've got, so we've got to take account of our carbon emissions. I don't think there's any doubt that the climate is changing, and I think generally the consensus is that as human beings living, working on the planet, we are certainly having a great effect on that. However, no matter how hard we try, it is impossible to reduce our carbon emissions to zero. I'm not prepared to stop breathing, neither are you, I'm sure. So even just sat here now delivering this webinar, I'm using electricity, I'm using energy, I'm talking to you. Every time I breathe out, I'm breathing out carbon dioxide. However, carbon neutrality allows the closing of this gap by purchasing carbon offsets. And as I say, we'll look at what those are a little bit later on. So again, why do we do this? Again, I'll skip over this pretty quickly because a lot of this is fairly basic stuff now. But obviously the Earth's climate's seen many changes. Up to the last sort of 150 years or so, changes in climate have been entirely natural. The climate isn't a static beast, if you like. The climate does vary, and there are changes, historical changes. It's a well-proven fact that there have been warm periods and cold periods even within the last 1,000 years. However, the current changes are as a result increasing human population and associated activities. However, as I speak to people, as I interact with people through audits and in my daily life, I come across probably three possible positions. You've got the true climate change deniers, that global warming is not occurring, and so neither is climate change. So nothing to worry about, guys. We're just carrying on as we are, and it's all entirely natural. That global warming and climate change are occurring, and I think that's fairly obvious. We do see changes in the weather patterns, but these are natural cyclic events completely unrelated to human activity. And then the third one, that global warming is occurring mainly as a result of human activity, and so climate change is also the result of that human activity. And that's probably where I would sit in that. Global warming is occurring mainly as a result of human activity. I have no doubt there is some natural movement in there as well, but human activity is greatly enhancing the effects of the natural changes. And I think that's where I probably sit, if I'm being honest. So again, what's causing it? The use of fossil fuels releasing into the atmosphere stores of carbon that were buried, sequestered millions and millions of years ago. You burn oil, you burn coal, you use gas. That gas was carbon that was locked away millions, if not billions of years ago. And adding this old carbon into the world's current stock tips the balance, and obviously further insulates the Earth, causing that global warming. So the main culprits, what are they? Obviously, carbon dioxide is one of, if not the main culprit, as you can see from the right, so the left-hand pie chart. Carbon dioxide through fossil fuel burning and other industrial processes. There are industrial and chemical processes that produce carbon dioxide, account for about 2/3 of the total greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. If you add to that the carbon dioxide that is coming from forestry and other land use, so that's more sort of naturally occurring, but through the use of land. So even plowing a furrow down a field, turning the soil is releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So take those two apart, and you're probably up to 3/4 of those gases of carbon dioxide. About 16% is methane. To be fair, some of that is naturally occurring. Some of that is from industrial processes. Methane is produced through the decomposition of organic materials. So we get methane coming out of landfill sites. We get methane coming out from oil drilling, oil fields. So there's a lot of methane produced, and methane is about, and I've seen varying numbers, but the figures I tend to rely on are about 30 times as potent as carbon dioxide. So 1 kilogram of methane is the same as 30 kilograms of carbon dioxide. We then go through some of the other smaller gases, but as you can see, they have a much greater potential. So nitrous oxide, if it's not being sniffed by kids these days, nitrous oxide is a byproduct of fertilizer production and usage, but does have somewhere between 250 and 300 times the potency. F-gas, aircon, so we're talking about fluorinated greenhouse gases here, so aircon, chillers, freezers, that sort of thing. A lot of these F-gases have replaced the old ozone depleting substances, and again, there's a lot of work going on to reduce the use of the higher greenhouse gas equivalent F-gases, but somewhere between 800 and 10,000. Very rarely do you come across any at the upper echelon of that now. And by far the worst, and I do come across this quite a bit, a gas called sulfur hexafluoride, SF6, used extensively in insulators in high voltage applications. So you can see there where all this stuff's coming from. So most oops, just a second, just moving stuff around a little bit so I can see. So most countries of the world have actually set carbon reduction targets, the UK being one of them. And a lot of this goes back to the Climate Change Act of 2008, which sets the legislative basis for this country's action on climate change. And we've committed to reducing economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by at least 68% by 2030, compared to the baseline year of 1990. And this has been done through a series of carbon budgets. So if you look at the graph, CB1 through to CB6 are the carbon budgets, and you can see where we are currently, still in period 4, on that lower trajectory. Now, obviously, I will be the first to say that the recommended net zero pathway does not actually go right the way down to zero. That will be an absolute impossibility. No idea exactly where it's going to end up, because obviously the figures on the left-hand side are in million tons of carbon. So it will end up somewhere a lot lower, but it might flatten out somewhere, I'm guessing, in the sort of 150 to 100 range. That's a chart, that's a graph that was produced by what at the time were BEIS, Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and that was based on some statistics from a few years ago now. But anyway, that is where we're at, and that is the trajectory that we're trying to follow. Now, obviously, since this presentation was last delivered, since I included this slide, we in the UK have a new government. They're still finding their feet, and a number of things are likely to change. However, this was the 10-point plan put forward by the previous government in terms of getting us on track, or keeping us on track, to achieve that position of net zero. In other words, getting as far as we can. So looking at things like offshore wind, obviously the first thing, or one of the first things that the current new administration in the UK has done is now reopen the ability to have onshore wind as well. So back to wind turbines on the hills, on the land, wherever. So that may have changed. Increasing use of hydrogen, nuclear, developing the next generation of small and advanced reactors. There is a suggestion, a movement to use some Rolls-Royce produced small nuclear reactors. I was working down in Derby the other day on a road called Rainsway, which is right next to Rolls-Royce, and they have one of these on site. The company I was working with, which is next door, had all sorts of warnings up about what to do if the siren goes off, if there's any health and safety issues. But they have a number of small reactors, the sort that would normally fit in something like a nuclear submarine, and using those would produce virtually carbon-free electricity. Electric vehicles, public transport, work on Jet Zero, which is looking at the emissions from flying, maritime as well, zero emission planes, ships, looking at lower carbon emissions. Homes, public buildings, heat pumps, we're certainly not going to meet that target of 600,000 heat pumps every year. However, looking at buildings being more energy efficient, looking at better insulation, nature, obviously planting trees, and then some innovation and finance. So you can see what's in there. The caveat on that is that was the previous administration, and some of that may and will change. So going forward, and we're at a point now where we're getting rid of the introductory stuff, and we'll move on to the core bits of the presentation. We're at an important inflection point. We have been for a number of years. We've all got to come together to take some sort of action. There is a growing global consensus around I shall say a net zero carbon future. We can't currently, with current technology, we can't have a zero carbon future, but possibly a net zero carbon future. And to achieve the goals that were set in Paris a few years ago, we've got to halve global emissions over the next decade and rapidly adapt to our warming climate. And Carolyn Fairbairn, who was a past director of the Confederation of British Industries, stated a few years ago now, immediate and decisive action is needed to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change and to create opportunities, and mainly investment opportunities, job opportunities, business opportunities in the low carbon, with low carbon activities. So one of the things that, and this sort of comes back to a question that Greg asked sorry, not Greg, Jens asked a little bit, no, sorry, Greg, it was Greg, about 14,001 and why you might need another standard, or do you need another standard? you've probably all heard the term greenwashing, an attempt to capitalise on the growing demand for environmentally sound products. And it can convey a false impression that a company or its products are environmentally sound. And here, again, within the UK, within Europe, Ryanair, a year or two ago, was accused of greenwashing after the UK advertising watchdog banned an ad campaign claiming that the airline had got the lowest carbon emissions of any major airline in Europe. And there was a group called Transport and Environment who accused Ryanair of greenwashing instead of actually tackling its core emissions. The airline had run a low emissions ad campaign for about 5 or 6 months. And it started doing that because it was the first non-coal based company to be named in the top 10 European Union carbon emitters. So obviously places like power stations and things were much higher. And the quote from Transport and Environment said Ryanair should stop greenwashing and start doing something to tackle its sky-high emissions. And Michael O'Leary responded by saying that environmentalists should be shot, and has repeatedly denied that the climate crisis is driven by carbon emissions which obviously aviation produces in abundance. So that's just a little example of greenwashing and how actually greenwashing can backfire against you. So how do we stop greenwashing? By making sure that we have genuinely green products, green services, sustainable products, call it what you will, that can back up their claims with facts and with details. How do we do this? I'm sure you're all expecting the answer: to use a recognised, publicly available standard, which is the specification for the demonstration of carbon neutrality. It specifies the requirements to be met by an entity, and we'll look at that word in a minute, seeking to demonstrate carbon neutrality through the quantification, the reduction and offsetting of greenhouse gas emissions from what the standard terms as a uniquely identified subject. Just like you would in a normal management system, what's the scope of the declaration you're making? Who's it about and what are the boundaries? So this standard came into effect 14 years ago, been around a long time, was reissued 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago, and has been replaced by ISO 14068-1 2023. So that standard was produced last year. And as a standard, it will be formally withdrawn on the 30th of November next year. We're still talking about this at the moment because this is where most people are, the standard that most people are still using. But to allay your fears, anybody using this standard, it is almost a seamless transition from PAS 2060 across to 14068. It demonstrates environmental integrity, gives a clear, credible, backed up message to instill customer trust in that message, will help meet increasing customer demand for environmentally friendly, sustainable, I'm not so keen on the term environmentally friendly, but environmentally sustainable products and services, engage and motivate staff and other stakeholders, people connected, whether they're shareholders, whether they're customers, whether they're suppliers, help them all reduce costs, work efficiently and effectively through operational behavioural changes, and ultimately allows you to stand out from the competition. Can actually demonstrate that all of this stuff is real, and we have a third-party certification that will back that up. So how does it work? So the standard sets out 4 key principles, and those 4 key principles are measure, reduce, offset, document and validate. And it allows for, once that's been through, a specific carbon neutrality statement to be fully verified. And that's done through the examination of documents, evidence. Yes, spreadsheets, as I said earlier, it's very similar to financial accounting, except we're dealing in kilograms and tons of carbon, and also forward-looking plans, because it is all about that trajectory as well, that trajectory of reducing. It's not about offsetting and just standing still. So the entity is the determination of the subject. It's to be uniquely identified, company name, address, postcode. Identify the subject of the declaration of the carbon neutrality. So it might just be a company name at a particular site. Establish all characteristics, purposes, objectives, functionality. What is it that that declaration is going to include, and make sure that everything that we expect to be taken into account has been taken into account. So looking at all the activities material to the fulfillment, achievement, or delivery of the subject. So if you're making widgets, and that's going to be the declaration of a factory making widgets, we need to make sure that everything that goes into that manufacturing process has been taken into account. And as you can see there, entities could include almost anything. I challenge you to find anything that isn't in there, in the entity side. I think we've covered almost every type of entity you can think of. And with 2060, past 2060, you can have different things. You can cover activities, you can cover products, you can cover services, you can cover buildings, projects, major developments, events, and other things. Obviously, one of the questions that sometimes get asked is, how does this fit in with some of the other PAS standards? So there's PAS 2080, things like that. They are slightly different, but still set out to achieve the same thing. Some of them are more related to actual product certification rather than certification of an organization. So what are the, obviously we talked about the 4 bits of PAS 2060. What does it actually require? So the starting point for all of this is to calculate the actual carbon footprint for the entity, the boundaries, the scope, whatever you want to call it, seeking the declaration. There's a number of methodologies that can be used. Most popular is ISO 14064/1. So any of the ISO 1406, so 14061 all the way through, are all related to carbon. So obviously ISO 14068, carbon neutrality, 14064/1 is a methodology for calculating your carbon footprint. There's other ways that can be used. There's the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. They have a greenhouse gas protocol. The UK government have an environmental reporting protocol. Businesses within the UK above a certain size have to follow what's called SECR. That's carbon reporting. That's an element of carbon reporting in the company's annual statements. So that's another way. And again, people can also use some elements of PAS 2050, which is specification for the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of goods and services. So there's a lot of different ways of actually achieving this. However, whatever method you use, and the standard allows you to choose whatever method you want, you have to calculate the actual carbon footprint for the entity. Now, obviously, that talks about pulling together, as the standard says now, a minimum of 95% of the total calculated emissions. So when you're doing that calculation, you can exclude emissions that constitute less than 1% of the total. So how does that work? So the way I say to people is, there may be some things that are certainly so small that you don't need to take them into account. The problem, as I sometimes say, is that if they are getting near that 1%, then we may require, as an assessment body, we may require demonstration of the actual percentage. And once you've worked that out, you might as well actually include it. But to get to the 95%, the sum of all those little bits, the sum of all those 1% or less than 1% has to be less than 5%. So we have to make sure that across all of the scopes, we've covered 95%. Scope 1, direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. So you've got a gas boiler, you've got a vehicle, you've got a car, you've got a lorry, you've got whatever it is, it's burning diesel, it's burning petrol, your gas boiler's burning gas. Those are direct emissions from owned or controlled sources, things that you're directly in charge of, directly managing. Scope 2, indirect emissions from the generation of purchased electricity, steam, heating and cooling. For most people, that's electricity. Electricity is generated somewhere and comes down the line, and you've got to take into account the generation of that. And the UK government every year produces figures to say a kilowatt hour of electricity produces this amount of carbon. And then scope 3, and somebody's already jumped in. Does scope 3 include financial services? Yes, it does. All other indirect emissions that occur in an organisation's value chain. Now, obviously, in there, I've just put waste treatment, purchasing of goods or services. There we go. I might add that in just to stop those sorts of questions coming through again. Purchasing of goods and services, business travel, employee commuting, etc., etc., etc. And for most companies, scope 3 is probably in excess of 75% of the total carbon footprint. So just pausing for breath and pausing for a drink. So once we've actually decided what our carbon footprint is, and if you like, set that figure, so that becomes a baseline, we then have to come up with a carbon management plan. So in other words, what are we going to do to reduce it? Because this is not about standing still. This is about continual improvement. This is about working towards that SBTI, if you like, figure, that net zero. So what we encourage people to try and aim for is a realistic trajectory of reduction. That trajectory we would suggest should follow the trajectory as set for that sector by the Science Based Targets Initiative. Whether or not you've actually signed up and made a commitment to follow that, that's entirely up to you. That's optional. This standard does not require that. But those trajectories are now considered to be best practice in terms of what should the slope of the graph look like. So there has to be a carbon management plan, which starts off with a public commitment to carbon neutrality. And all of this stuff we're talking about now becomes public data, if you like. Public commitment to carbon neutrality, a timescale for achieving carbon neutrality of the defined entity, specific targets for greenhouse gas reductions that are appropriate to the timescale. How are we going to achieve those? What is it we're going to do to reduce our emissions? Is that going to be efficiencies within our operation? Is it going to be stripping out older lighting, installing LED lighting? Are we going to be swapping over our gas boilers for air source heat pumps or some other type of technology? Are we going to install solar PV on the roofs? There's an awful lot of ways that we can do that, but you have to justify how you're going to achieve it. And as part of that plan, to justify the technique you're using and how you're going to measure that, and also, and we don't see this happen very often, the time period that any historic reductions are calculated over, and that a constant methodology has been used. In certain circumstances, you can look slightly backwards and say that we are already doing some of this work. And then finally, the offsetting strategy to be used, including an estimate at the start of the quantity required, assessment of the quantity reduced. It's an annual plan, has to be updated annually, continual improvement, and the declared reduction can be absolute. So in other words, this year we produced 1,000 tons of carbon. Next year we're going to aim to produce 950 tons, or intensity. So going back to a widget manufacturer, you could argue tons of carbon per 1,000 widgets produced, and that is an intensity figure. And doing it that way, that does not penalise a growing company. Right, I'm starting to get some questions now around some slightly more technical stuff around scope 3 and methodologies. So I will, if you don't mind, Greg and Jens, hold those over towards the end. So offsetting. So once the amount of carbon's been established to an appropriate level of assurance, the carbon credits can then be procured and retired on your behalf. So what we mean by retiring, and it's a phrase you might often see, if you buy a carbon credit, once it's retired, it means that nobody else can buy that credit again, and we need formal proof of that retirement. And that is one of the issues that have been, because sometimes carbon offsetting has had a bad press. Unsurprisingly, wherever there's money to be made, there will be people unscrupulously try and make money out of it, and carbon offsetting has become one of them. However, as we'll see on the next slide, there are a number of assurance schemes. So the cost of offsets vary considerably, and it is a market at supply and demand, so it does change quite a bit. So PAS 26 requires the total amount of emissions to be offset by high quality certified credits, which meet the following criteria. It's got to be from an approved scheme. So it lists, for example, the Clean Development Mechanism, Joint Implementation, Gold Standard, Voluntary Carbon Standard. They have to be genuinely addition. So you can't count reductions that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the offset. So in other words, the offset, the money that's put in, has to be going towards either the building of something, the creation of something, the management of a scheme that is reducing carbon, and verified by an independent third party to ensure that emission reductions are permanent to avoid leakage. So what we mean by leakage, carbon leakage is, for example, if we close down all our steel making facilities in the UK, that might be happening, you never know, hope not. If we were to do that, we would then be buying steel in from somewhere else, India, China, no idea where. The fact that we could say, wow, look at this, guys, we've got no emissions, we don't make any steel anymore, but actually we're just buying it in from somewhere else in the world. Probably steel produced with a higher carbon emission and then transporting it halfway around the world. So that's what we mean by leakage, making sure then that this isn't just moving stuff to somewhere else in the world, and these offsets have to be retired to what's called the credible registry. So this is just a snip from the standard itself that talks about the different approved schemes. And again, you can read that. That's a slide within the presentation. Just to give you some ideas, and again, this is just a little bit of background information. You can just read this in your own time. It gives you some ideas about the amount of carbon that we all tend to produce. What I find interesting is to compare the UK and the EU, and they're broadly the same. We are broadly the same with somewhere like the USA, which is about 2.5 times as potent as we are. So yeah, that's there. And then if you look, for those of you that have the pleasure of flying business class, again, you can see there that your emissions are deemed to be probably 3 times as high as those of us sat in cattle class. Okay, so the final stage of the entire process is the documentation, verification, and declaration of actual carbon neutrality. So this actually requires a statement, and it's a public statement, that the required standards have been met, and it's supported by what's called a qualifying explanatory statement. And the standard requires public disclosure of all the documentation supporting the carbon neutrality statement. So in practice, this includes proof of the emissions reduction, proof of the withdrawal of offsetting credits, the carbon footprint report itself, a copy of the carbon management plan, and obviously the documented qualifying explanatory statement itself. And the requirement to provide all of this information is fundamental to the final validation of carbon neutrality status. Now, the standard allows for 3 actual types of validation. Self-validation, which to me is the weakest. So you can say, we are carbon neutral. Here is our qualifying explanatory statement. We have worked to the principles of PAS 2060. You've got to believe us, because we're honest. The one I always smile about, if you're in the UK and you'll have seen the adverts, Marks and Spencer's claim to be carbon neutral. They claim to follow PAS 2060, and every year they issue a self-validated qualifying explanatory statement. And my joke somewhat is, you have to believe them, because this is not just carbon neutrality. This is Marks and Spencer's carbon neutrality. And they're relying on their good name to say, well, actually, why wouldn't we believe them? I would disagree. I always think that some degree of validation by an independent body is better. I would say that because I work for one, but however, you can be validated by a non-accredited organisation. So there are an awful lot of consultants out there who are offering to hold your hand through this process. They can sign you off. That's a little bit like what we would call second party accreditation or second party validation. They've got an interest, they've worked with you, they are independent from you, but they do have an interest in that declaration. Or it could be an organisation that's doing it that is not accredited at all. Now, we as NQA, currently for PAS 2060, we are able to use our current accreditation for energy and environmental management, that's 14,001 and 50,001, that gives us full recognition as being able to offer accredited independent third-party validation. That is detailed within the standard itself. Obviously, going forward, when we get on to ISO 14068/1-1, there is a UCAS scheme for that, and we are a part of that scheme. So our process, if you went through this process with us, obviously, if you remember, it's a 4-stage process that the standard requires. We look at that in 3 different ways. So we start off with a pre-verification, and that's a little bit like if you've been through a management system audit. That's a bit like a stage 1. It's determining your your readiness for full verification. And it's used to help us understand who you are, what your characteristics are, what your activities are, what the processes are, and help us to put together a risk-based verification plan to be implemented at stage 2. So because a lot of this is actually verifying your outputs, your emissions, we don't want to spend time looking at those 1%. So we need to work out a risk-based approach so that we spend our verification time verifying the big numbers, the numbers that really matter. The stage 2 is to then carry out a full review of your own greenhouse gas inventory. And we use that methodology 14061. So that will include an assessment of the method, so how you've captured data, look at the analysis, look at the conversions that you've used, because obviously in a lot of cases you're converting litres of diesel into greenhouse gas emissions, you're converting kilowatt hours of gas or electricity, you're converting hotel night stays, you're converting mileage, you're converting waste and all sorts of different things into kilograms, tons of carbon. And typically the stage 2 involves NQA, will involve us visiting your location for a site visit. And then the third part of the process is something that I'm actually in the middle of doing today. I've broken off doing this to actually deliver this webinar, is an independent review. So within NQA, somebody who is also a lead verifier in this process, but has not been involved in the process whatsoever, so the client I'm verifying today, I have had no input into the stage 1 or the stage 2. I am then doing a secondary review of all the workings from all the parties, so our workings, the client's workings, to make sure that there is then further assurance and integrity. And again, this is informative only, and there is no client presence required. That's done, as I say, I'm sat at home, sat in my study, and I'm just doing that with all the information that's been provided. Right. I've mentioned this standard a bit, 14068. Actually, this is where we are going to be going in the very, very short space of time, and it won't be too long before we start to pull the shutters down on PAS 2060 and say, actually, anybody coming in now will be looking at 14068. We're not at that stage yet, but we're not far off. So 14068 is titled as a specification relating to greenhouse gas management and related activities, namely carbon neutrality. And there is, as I've said a couple of times, a general alignment between the current standard, PAS 2060, and 14068, and it was published in November 2023, so about 9 months ago. It establishes a hierarchy for carbon neutrality. This is where it's slightly different, where greenhouse gas emission reductions and greenhouse gas removal enhancements take priority over offsetting. One of the criticisms that is sometimes levied at PAS 2060 is that it can be all about offsetting. Now, I would disagree, because we put just as much effort into looking at the reduction strategy as we do in just buying a load of carbon offsets and saying, here you go, there we are, we're carbon neutral. So without that reduction, then we would not be certifying you, in the standard PAS 2060 wouldn't really want you to be certified. But it pushes the message, it enhances that message that greenhouse gas emission reductions and removal enhancements within the value chain take priority over offsetting. And it includes requirements for carbon neutrality commitments and making those subsequent claims. So there are a number of core principles within. There's actually 10. Some of them I've lumped together because they are in similar veins, if you like. Transparency, absolutely. Public disclosure to enable stakeholders to make educated decisions. Conservativeness, perhaps I ought to put a small c on that rather than a capital C, but it's the start of a sentence. Assumptions, values and procedures ensure that current progress is not overstated. So in other words, if you're making an assumption about an amount of carbon that you are using, and there is an assumption, so you can't necessarily verify it all, you have to make a bit of an assumption, you over-assume rather than under-assume. So you take a conservative approach. There is this hierarchy of greenhouse gas hierarchy. So reductions, removals within the boundary and value chain, and that's known as insetting, not offsetting. Insetting is when you make those reductions within your own organization. And then finally, offsetting. And then supporting transition. So one of the things it's looking at doing is enabling sustainable development and trying to get us all to move away from this business as usual approach. And it includes the word urgency. So it's asking for immediate and ongoing action. There is now a formal link into the science-based approach that it expects the trajectories to follow the latest climate science and periodic reviews when making decisions. So at the moment, as I say, we would, and the standard would suggest that you follow that SBTI trajectory, but that trajectory may well change, and I'm sure it will. So therefore, we expect, or the standard would expect, those decisions to reflect, or to be reflected in your own trajectories. Accountability rests with the entity, rests with yourselves, rests with the business that controls the subject. So in other words, the business is accountable for its own declaration, and it does require, and there's been a little bit of debate about this, about do we have to fully include all scope 3 emissions if we're doing past 2060, and now this standard does state quite clearly it has to require a value chain and a life cycle approach. So that is, without shadow of a doubt, covering all scope 3 emissions. And that is really how 14068-1 fits together. And those of you with a formal management system might recognize that sort of approach. Commitment, selection of subjects and the boundaries. So in other words, we're going to be committed to do it. What are the boundaries going to be? What is it we're going to work towards achieving? What are we going to be working on? Is it our factory? Is it our entire business? Is it just one site? And then we then have this sort of virtual circle that we follow around. By the look of it this way, it's going anti-clockwise: quantify emissions and removals, develop a plan, implement greenhouse gas emissions reductions and increase removals, offset the remainder, meet the reporting requirements, meet the requirements for carbon neutrality claims. And the bit that I think is missing in that, and it wasn't me that drew that, we then go around again. So at the end of the first year, we then back to quantifying the emissions again, and we start the whole process again. So I actually think that 3 to 8 continues round in a circle. So before we get to the final question and answer, and I will make sure that I've finished the presentation bit by 3 o'clock or whatever time you're on. It's, what is it now? It's 5 to 3 here in the UK. So sometimes people ask me, if you can give me a number of tips, what sort of things would you suggest we look at? What are the tips? I've been doing this for years now. What sort of, what would I suggest? Certainly, and I would say this, as I've said before, seek accredited certification. Certification from approved external body like ourselves will bolster your credibility, and also can provide guidance. Now, we're not meant to be consultants, but one of the things we pride ourselves on, that we think stands ourselves out from the rest, is what we call value added, assessing value added validation. So we will, if something is not right, we will tell you why it's not right, and guide you, not give you the solution, but we'll make sure that you are going in the right direction to put right whatever has been an issue. Make the use of technology. There's a lot of technology out there, dashboards, there's database solutions. There's a question about methodology and calculations. I'll come back to that in a minute, but there's an awful lot of information out there now that will help you. Leadership, it's got to come from the top. It's no good this being something that you're beavering on as a lone person within your business. There's got to be buy-in from an organization's senior management. So embedding large-scale change, which is what these standards require throughout an organization, has to have buy-in and visible support from senior leaders. That said, we need to share responsibility across the organization, across the company. Collaborate with other organizations. If you are going down this route and following now 14068, as we've said, it requires life cycle approach, it requires a value chain. You are going to have to speak to your suppliers. You're going to have to speak to your partners. They may be doing something similar. So therefore, work together, work to achieve this mutual benefit. And ultimately, I think the one tip that I would more than anything stress, make sure that you're playing your fair part in cutting carbon, helping the world, if you like, reach the global goal of attaining a net zero emission. And the one tip I would say is, if you're following this route, if you're going down this trail, use the SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative trajectories as your roadmap. So that's it really. A couple of slides just again. It's back to this is who we are, this is the sort of stuff we can offer. I'm not going to dwell on those because you can read those at your own leisure. Some of the training that we do offer more formal training. This is just a webinar giving you, whetting your appetite if you like. If you wanted to do this more formally, we do offer training programs to help you do this yourself. Right, so let me see where we've got in terms of the questions. So it's virtually 3 o'clock now. If anybody wants to leave, feel free to do so. I won't hold it against you. You will be able to catch up on the questions if you when you listen to the recording of it. There's no more presentation, but you might find some of the questions interesting. I'm hoping it's going to take no more than 5 or 10 minutes to go through the questions. So looking at the questions that I've asked. So the first one is, this is Greg. If I'm reporting scope 3 within the report to the government and my third-party supplier is reporting their scope 1 and 2, won't the results overlap? Absolutely correct. And one of my, not issues, because unfortunately it's a globally recognized way of doing this now, your scope 3 emissions are clearly somebody else's scope 1 and scope 2. Absolutely. I fully agree. And there's not a lot we can do about it. So if you are accounting for somebody delivering castings to your manufacturing company, you have to account for the scope 3 emissions of that delivery. The company delivering them that will be their scope 1 emissions. So yes, absolutely, there is a degree of double counting, but bearing in mind that this is all about, what was the phrase, conservativeness, and making sure we're not undercounting. It is considered that whilst it might not be 100% correct, it is erring on the right side of that, if you like. Do I know if there is any methodology for calculations of emissions from energy from waste? Steam from waste incineration? Yes, there are. There are a number of actual methodologies. You're slightly straying away from some of my areas of expertise. There's a set of government conversion factors that are produced by DEFRA, and I think they're called DESNES now, Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. They produce every year a set of conversion factors that convert quantities of steam, quantities of gases, quantities of energy, quantities of electricity, quantities of fuel into kilograms, tons of carbon. So that may well help you there. Right, could a construction company use a justification for excluding materials and the scope 3 emissions where the designer selects materials that have a high greenhouse gas emission the construction company can influence but not control? I see this quite a lot. I do a lot of work in construction, and sadly, I would tend to say that no, you can't. What we try to do, I understand, you know, obviously designers themselves would now try and point out the most sustainable outcome. However, if a client wants something with Brazilian hardwood mahogany banisters and all sorts of very high carbon materials in there, you're sort of stuck with it. What I would perhaps argue is ultimately you could choose whether to take on that work. If you are so concerned about that and concerned about how that might affect your carbon emissions, you could say no. You could say we on principle we don't want to take that work on, and that's in my mind when the companies demonstrate how serious they are with this stuff. Are you willing to put ethical concerns over profits? If I were to purchase offsets, how long do they last for? I.e., can I count them every year going forward? No. So once you've bought an offset, that offset will actually be worth a ton of carbon. That's not a ton of carbon every year. That is a ton of carbon that's being produced. So you might spend a lot of this trading is done in dollars. So I'll use the dollar term. You might pay £20 or $20, should I say, $15, $20 for a ton of carbon. That is 1 ton that's being prevented from being offset, that's being released into the atmosphere. That's 1 ton that's being prevented from release. You can't resell that ton because you've already paid for that ton, and that ton's being prevented. So every year you have to buy new offsets. So once those offsets have been retired, the benefit of the offset that you've bought has gone. It's been utilized. It can't be counted again. And that is where counting them every year going forward has been one of the things that's given offsetting a bad name. So unfortunately, if your emissions are 1,000 tons this year, you have to buy 1,000 tons of carbon offsets. If they've dropped to 900 tons next year, you have to buy a fresh set of 900 kilograms or tons, should I say, of carbon. So I think that's all the questions I had. Sorry, I'm jumping around now. So thank you.